Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. So, this is going to be a very different episode, both in terms of form and in terms of substance. It is going to be entirely recorded in English, and we have a very special international guest. So, today's guest is Cal Newport, who is not only a well known computer science professor, but is also a best selling author. And his work is mainly focused on the intersection of technology, productivity, and well being. So, Carl, is an absolute pleasure to have you here with me today.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, thanks for having me. I wish I could be there in person in Milan. It sounds like
Next
a lovely
time.
place to be. Sure.
Next time, I hope so. So actually, I read, as I was mentioning, I read several of your books, Deep Work, Digital Minimalism, and Slow Productivity. And digital minimalism is has been really an eye opener for me and my community. This is the book that we chose for our recent book club, and I actually proposed this book just by reading the title to the community I have, saying that this is probably a book that we all need to read. And it actually turned out to be true. So it led to enriching reflections for all of us. So I'm really happy that you're joining us, and I can't wait to dive deeper actually in your insights. All right, so I will start with a broad question. And the question is the following. So, if you were to change, or better, if you were to fix something in today's society, what would that be?
Well, okay, I'm going to say two things because I've written about two technology related issues that I think are due a major fix. Right. So, one, in terms of life outside of work. So, if we're thinking about people's personal relationship with technology, I would fix this idea that was really raised in the first decade of the 21st century that what we needed to do was take the internet, which had then been around for about a decade or so as a consumer tool, and we had to build these massive platform monopolies, these private versions of the internet, like Instagram, like Facebook, more recently like TikTok, that somehow that this was the best way for the internet to function was instead of it being an open, distributed, democratic network that anyone could build tools on, that we would have a small number of tools run by giant companies that everyone felt
Mhm.
like they had to use. So I've long argued that that was a detour from the original vision of the internet that I think I'd be happy not to make. Then in the world of work, I have one other
Okay.
change I would make. In the world of work, we had this other unrelated problem where new tools entered the office. In particular, it was at first email and then followed
Mm-hmm.
by other higher speed communication tools like Slack and like Microsoft Teams. We put these tools into the office with no guardrails, no thinking, just, hey, use these. And it transformed the nature of office work in particular to be defined by this constant, ongoing, overloading amount of communication, which I've also argued
Sure.
in my books is a sort of a massive disaster for both the sustainability of these jobs and the actual economic productivity of these organizations. Those are my two changes. We don't need to build private versions of the internet on in the place of apps that everyone feels like they have to use, and we should have been much more careful about introducing low friction communication into the office.
Yeah, actually, sometimes I wonder that if we could go back in time, actually, to probably 10 years ago and choose whether or not to have the same level of penetration of technology into our lives, what would our choices be? So I remember that one of the chapters you're opening the digital minimalism book is we don't want it, we didn't choose to have these level of interconnection. We didn't choose to have this level of being constantly overwhelmed by technology. And so my question is, what are your thoughts on this? So what do you think that technology is really subtracting to us today? So what are we losing to technology?
Right, because there's a good side of the internet, right? Let's use the internet as an example. I'm a computer scientist, I'm a big internet booster. We have the good side of the internet, which is it's a universal communication protocol. So anyone can connect their machine to the internet and they can have a server, they can have an app, they can have a website, and anyone else can access it. There was no gatekeeper. There was no who gets to be on the internet and who doesn't. And that allowed for an explosion of information, for connection, for experimentation. It was a very fantastic, I think, innovation. Then we had the Web 2 revolution. So Web 2.0 revolution, this is the early 2000s. At first, this was a positive revolution. It's where we introduced tools to make it easier to post information online, right? So the Web 2 revolution kicked off with blogs. Where
Mm-hmm.
blogs, it was much easier now to publish stuff online. It used to be you had to write HTML code. It was kind of a pain to put something on the internet, especially the web. But then we got blogs and these technologies where, like, oh, I can type into a box and press publish, and anyone can read it. That was all fine, but it led to the idea. These social media companies came along and said, wait a second, let's try to own that. And so what we're going to do at first is build like really, really easy tools for publishing your own thing online. And this is what Facebook originally was. It's very
Yeah.
nicely designed tools for publishing. And they offered this friend idea that you can easily connect with your friends, and your friends will look at your content and you will look at their content, and everyone will feel like people are paying attention to them, and it's fine. Then they realized around the time of the mobile revolution, well, wait a second, there's money to be made, not just by how many people use this, but how long they are using it each day. And this
Mm-hmm.
led to the arms race of how do we get people looking at this information as long as possible. This led to the algorithmic amplification tools that were all built around engagement. It is that which really picked up speed starting around 2011, 2012. It was that move to build private versions of Web 2.0 that were now focused on engagement, not just
Mm-hmm.
subscribers, but engagement, that led to what I talk about in my book, which was this moment where people looked up and said, why am I looking at my phone all the time? Like, I didn't sign up for Facebook in 2006 with the idea that I was going to check my phone once every 3 minutes. I signed up
Yeah.
for Facebook to see the relationship status of my college boyfriend. Like, I would use it once or twice a week or whatever. That was the real change, is when we had a
Mm-hmm.
small number of companies who hijacked a Web 2 revolution, deciding that their business model was going to be built on engagement, and they got really good at that. And that's when people realized, why am I'm using this more than I want to. I'm looking
Mm-hmm.
at this phone more than I want to. And more so than the specific things they're seeing on the phone, the main complaint most people have is just time lost. Not that, okay, what I'm looking at the phone is
Yeah, I
bad,
totally agree.
but that I'm missing on all of these other good things I used to do or could be doing to instead just rabbit hole on TikTok.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I really appreciate the fact that you identified two components. So one is not only social media alone or the phone alone, because by itself the phone is just a tool. I mean, if you have not any apps, if you don't have internet connection, a phone is like almost useless. The combination is phone and platforms like social media, TikTok, Instagram, whatever, that are constantly drowning us. However, I see the point that so my generation, I'm almost 30 years old, so I'm 28, and I feel that my generation is probably the one who has the responsibility, or better, the chance to set which is the direction we're going to move forward, because it's actually why it's a widespread feeling that this is not okay. So I feel that there are people, so 15 years old kids, that are saying, oh, I quit Instagram. So I left these social media platforms, as if they were detoxing from like a drug in like their early teenage years. Um, and I also think that my generation is probably the last one to know how the world looked like without social media. So we remember how it was entering a subway without seeing people, which were constantly absorbed by their phones, that were like crossing the street holding their phones on their hands. But it's really hard for me now to see what we should do. So it's really hard for me to translate this feeling, this exhaustion, because you feel exhausted. And later on, I really would like to deep dive on the topic of social media, because for me it's like extremely interesting, given the premise that I do work on social media part time, but I still do work on social media. So I feel that we lack something, and probably something which was one of the reasons why I really desperately wanted to talk to you, is that we don't have any guidance, we don't have any rules. No one is teaching us what we should do with our phones. Even parents, I feel that when I'm like at a restaurant and I see parents that have their kids and they're giving like the phone and the tablet to their kids, and I'm like, oh my god, like you have no idea of what is happening. Or I mean, like, is there something, do we know what's the minimum amount of time that we should spend on the screens such that it doesn't lead to a detrimental effect on our health?
Well, I mean, what I argue for is, not for kids, but for adults, what I argue for is your phone should just be boring. I think this is the easiest solution here. Your phone should be boring. That is, it doesn't have any app on it in which the owners of that app make more money the more time you use it, right? Now, let's say you have a professional reason to use social media. Great, you can do that on a computer. Like, okay, I run a show, I run a podcast, we publish clips of it or this or that. That could be completely professionalized and organized and structured. Twice a week we go onto the Instagram account, like on the computer, we have the edited files and we put them on there. But my phone is boring. Another thing I argue is you make your phone not a constant companion, right? So when you're home, you don't have your phone in your pocket. You have it plugged in at a common place where you charge it, like by your front door in your kitchen. And when you need to look something up or you're going to check to see if someone texted you, you go to where that phone is plugged in, but it's not with you. So if you're sitting down and watching TV, you'll have that knee-jerk reaction of this is a little bit boring in this moment. Let me look up something else, or it's not there. It's not with you. When you're having, you're sitting there, you're eating a meal, you're like, oh, let me just look up something on board. It's not there. So whatever, you grab a book or put something else on. I think this idea of eliminating the relationship with your phone as a constant companion and turning it back into a tool that is incredibly useful, but you just use it as needed. It's not with you all the time. That alone gives you a completely different cognitive reality. It's a
Mm-hmm.
reality where you don't always have that urgent itch of having to check. It's a reality when you're more comfortable with yourself and your own thoughts. It's a reality in which you're able to actually ease into a more steady focus on other things that matter in a way that's impossible when you have that digital ping right there in the pocket. So, I mean, I'm telling adults, make your phone not that exciting. Like, it's a great podcast listener and the map is great. And if you're out and about and you're texting your friends, iMessage or WhatsApp is really good for doing that. And that's sort of
Mm-hmm.
what you use the phone for. It is not a constant distraction companion.
Mm-hmm.
I think that simple idea, more so than any specific thing you do, could really change your life.
Mm-hmm. So what would you mean by boring? So just the essential apps, the essential tools, or
Yeah,
like for
that there.
instance, how does your phone look like?
So I'm saying there's no Instagram, there's no TikTok, there's no Twitter, there's no Facebook. So what is the phone used for? Largely the things that Steve Jobs talked about in the original 2007 keynote where he introduced the iPhone, where he said, this is a fantastic music player slash audio book podcast player. It's a fantastic phone. It's got a really good interface as a phone. It's a really good text communicator. And these three things work really well together. And if you want to look up a map, it's right there. If you need to look up on a website, what are the hours of this restaurant we're thinking of going to, you get that information right there. But in the original Steve Jobs vision, and I actually went back and for the digital minimalism, I interviewed the lead designer of the iPhone to really nail this down. In the original Steve Jobs vision, there was no notion that you would be looking at this thing all the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? That was not the way he was thinking about it. He was like, this is just really useful. I need to look this up. Oh, it's right here in my pocket. I'm
Mm-hmm.
listening to music in a phone call. He was huge on this. I'm listening to music and a phone call comes in. The music will stop and I can go to the phone call. And then when I'm done on the phone call, it goes back to the music. He's just this elegance of the stuff we were already doing. He wanted to make it more convenient. He did not have a vision of a future in which people used him all the time. That was actually a social media business strategy that came about 5 years later. So that's a
Mm-hmm.
boring phone. It's an incredibly useful tool. But if you are standing bored in line, doesn't necessarily have much to offer you in that moment.
Mm-hmm. But do you feel there is a gap also in terms of education? So do you think that, for instance, there is a lack also in terms of research of the effects that these tools are having on our mental and physical health? Because it's something that sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, so there is a growing. I mean, I've been reporting on it, and I know some of the researchers heavily involved in this, especially when it comes to mental health of adolescents. I think this research literature has become significantly more robust in the last couple of years. There's still a tendency, I think, in major media to
Mm-hmm.
parrot back a line that was maybe true 5 years ago that's not true today. They'll say, well, it's still unclear whether like social media is affecting the mental health of adolescents. Some studies say yes, some studies say no. That period is past. There's now multiple independent lines of research that are all pointing towards the same direction, which is we know there's mental health harms, especially for adolescent girls. especially pre-puberty, adolescent girls, especially heavy users of social media. There's very strong mental health detrimental harms. It's why here in the United States, for example, there is an emerging consensus from medical professionals that's just starting to come together that honestly, it's probably not safe to give unrestricted access to the internet through a smartphone to people until they're 16.
Mm-hmm.
Our Surgeon General has said this. I would say, John Haidt and Jean Twenge, who have really been ahead of studying the social psych research on this. This is what they have been suggesting as well. There's an increasing number of parental groups coming around this number. So this is a consensus that's slowly emerging. I think within maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, there will be a new standard where
Mm-hmm.
the
I agree.
average age in which you just give a smartphone to a kid, like this is yours now, is going to shift from right now, where this is happening at like 12, maybe 12 to 13. It's going to shift to be more like 16. That's going to head off a lot of adolescent mental health issues. So we know it's a problem at that age group. And if anything, that's a canary in the coal mine for what the rest of us is facing. But we know now that that's a problem in a way that we weren't quite sure before.
Mm-hmm. So you think that it's all on us, let's say. So it's all based on our ability to self-regulate. Because sometimes I have the feeling that it's a constant battle with ourselves, with our discipline. I think that one of your last episodes on your podcast was about discipline. So
Mhm.
how much do you think that this ability to interact in a mindful and healthier way with our technology is based on self-discipline and on like being more strict with oneself.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the only tool we have right now, right? I mean, so the issue mainly is social media platforms that are wired for high engagement. There's not, this is a very similar issue that we had with cigarettes in this country, right?
Mhm,
There's not a legislative fix. You can't go in there and say, hey, TikTok, be less addictive, right? Same thing with cigarettes. Nicotine was fundamental to the tobacco plant, right?
mhm,
So there's no way to go in to Philip Morris and say, make your cigarettes like a half as addictive, right? The best we could do is say, look, you don't want to be necessarily addicted to cigarettes. Kids shouldn't use them, and in general, everyone should try to quit. That's sort of where we are with social media, right? Uh, Basically, the message needs to get out. Social media is not the internet. It's a small number of really large companies that make a huge amount of money off your attention. It's a very exploitative relationship. There's no reason for you to be in this relationship to enjoy all the possibilities of connection, expression, discovery that the internet has to offer. You don't need to be on TikTok or Instagram or Twitter to do that. That's mainly just you clocking into an invisible digital factory and doing your shift to make money for Mark Zuckerberg, right? You don't need to be using these tools. You probably shouldn't be using these tools. That's where we're going to have to end up with these technologies. Say kids shouldn't use them at all. And if you're a grown up, we're not going to tell you not to smoke, but we are going to tell you it's probably not good for you. And you don't really need to be smoking to enjoy life. That's where I think
mhm,
we are with social media. But the key thing is understanding. And I think the younger the generation, the more social media has become intertwined with the idea of a phone, the more social media has become intertwined with the idea of the internet writ large. But as you pointed out, I think very smartly before, these are all separate issues. You have a phone, there's the internet, and then there's these very particular platforms, right? You can remove or minimize the footprint of those platforms on your life without having to give up a phone. You can remove or minimize the impact of those platforms on your life without having to stop using the internet or stop having the serendipity of discovery or connection or self-expression. All of this is very possible without having to be on Instagram or Twitter. And I think that message getting out there is
mhm,
going to be an effective one.
mhm. I can see that you have a really strong position against social media, and actually, I feel that I have to give you a little bit of context because I do actually work with social media. So just to share my experience, I began sharing posts on social media during COVID, when actually social media looked even very different from how it is today. And I'm talking about Instagram actually.
Okay.
And I was doing something completely different. So I was working in a strategic consulting company, and I didn't enjoy my time over there. So I started like sharing something about my mental health, and and I started my own podcast, and this became a second job. And at a certain point, I told to myself, okay, I really need to prioritize one of the two. Um, and I decided to quit my job as a knowledge worker. So I decided to quit my previous job as an employee, and I decided to build something of my own, starting from my social media platform. Still, I feel so. I Now I'm at the point in which my professional life is deeply linked to my social media presence. I still feel that my identity is very separate. So I am not the person that is on social media. I'm still myself. However, my professional life now, it's somehow linked to my social media presence, and I do love the fact that I have a community. I do love the fact that I am having a positive impact on people's lives. I do love the fact that I'm receiving like messages, positive messages by people. This is giving me a purpose. This is giving me fuel, which I didn't used to have while I was working in my previous job. Still, I find that there's something that is wrong because I am the first one who is completely sucked up by this world. So I feel that whenever I give up my control on the social media, so on my interaction on Instagram, I'm completely drowned. So I was really interested to see what's your take on that. So, do you feel that there is like a strong no on social media, or there is something that you can rescue from this kind of platforms? And do you see like a solution in using it in a more balanced and mindful way without like, and probably one of the tips I already caught was the interaction on the like computer, not using the mobile apps, which
Yeah.
might be a barrier. But do you think there's something else?
Yeah. Well, look, I think in the short term, we do have to figure out, a lot of people have to figure out, how can I maintain what feels like necessary connections to this technology without being sucked in? And that's what my book Digital Minimalism is basically about, right? So what is the digital minimalist approach? It says you start with what's really important to you, you figure that out, and then you work backwards from those values to figure out which technologies in my life are directly supporting things I care about. All right. So already this is a change to how most people approach technology. Most people approach technology by saying, if something looks interesting, I will use it by default until there's a big enough negative cost to using it that I'll remove it from my life, right? This is the sort of default use philosophy, which basically leads to you using most things. Nothing will ever cross that threshold. What happens then is you go through these cycles of, Instagram is really bumming me out, so I'm going to stop using it. And then you miss it. And then you tell yourself, well, there's these other things I like on it. And then you go back to it. So I'm not a big fan of the use everything by default and
Mm-hmm.
only opt out if you have a notable negative impact. Digital minimalism says, no, the default's nothing. Things have to earn, tools have to earn their way into your life because there's a strong story that this tool supports this thing I really care about. Now, what's important about this approach, what makes it really effective, is if you have a specific reason you're introducing a tool, let's say like a particular social media network into your life, if you have a specific reason why you're introducing it, it's much easier to put controlling fences or rules around it.
Mm-hmm.
So, right? So for example, in your case, it could be, look, Instagram. Instagram posts about these issues I care about is reaching a large audience. And I think it's doing good. And this is a value of mine. It's like I want to actually be helping other people, especially with these issues of mental health. And I can reach them on Instagram. That's where they are, right? If you know that's the way you're using it, then you can put all sorts of controls around it. So, like what we talked about before, if that's my point of using it, why would I have Instagram on my phone and be following 700 people and be spending all day in the sort of for you sort of algorithmically generated feed? No, that's not my value. My value is trying to reach people. So I'll have it on my computer. I access it through my browser. I do it twice a week. I prepare my post very carefully in an offline software, and then twice a week I go over, I drop it into the web interface, and I post it. Or even better, I have an assistant that just professionally posts, and I work in Google Docs, and they just come in twice a week and grab out the latest things, and they post it on there. Or, okay, I want to interact with my readers. If that's important to you, you might say, you know what? What's the best way to do this with technology? I don't love just reading Instagram comments because also we get the trolls, also we get the negativity. So why don't I use Instagram as a way of capturing people as attention on these topics, but then move them over to a much more controllable technological community? So maybe you have your podcast, and you have a mailing list or a forum, or somewhere else you have a newsletter that's run through Substack that has the comment function beneath it, where you're like, this is a way for me to interact with my audience. but
Mm-hmm.
not under the sort of the deranging glare of sort of general access social media, right? So that's digital minimalism, is
Mm-hmm.
figuring out what's important, saying how can technology help this thing that's important, and then using technology only in the way that helps that thing it's important. It's a very different approach. Now I said short term because I think long term I would like to see just more and more of this like very important type of work that you're doing and lots of people are doing move off of social media and find other ways to use the internet that have the same appeal. This is why I'm such a big booster, for example, of podcasts.
Yeah,
Podcasts are a
heard it.
finger in the eye of the social media platform monopolies. They're entirely independent. They're entirely distributed, right? Like your podcast is just on some server somewhere and has an RSS feed that any player anywhere can subscribe to and now have access to it. There's no giant company that owns it and mediates it and sells the ads on your behalf. You're not working on behalf of another company. Podcasting, I think, is this fantastic example of old school internet. People reaching other people with stuff that's important and interesting and new. And nothing about a podcast is designed to get you to, let's say, look at your phone 7 hours a day. It comes out once a week. It only lasts this long. So that's my long-term solution, is just more and more of interaction between people and audiences
Mm-hmm.
moves away from social media platforms and on the more controllable internet technologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noted that you made this difference between these independently produced content with a distributed model of curation versus
Yeah.
this centralized algorithm model. But doesn't, like, for instance, podcasts like platforms as well, like they suggest content based on your preferences. So aren't they using also an algorithmic model? So they're pushing the content that you like more and they're like revamping it up in order for you to interact with it. Is it like is it the way in which they're working as well, or they're different? Do you feel that
Yeah.
there's like huge difference?
Oh, they're trying, right? They're trying to
Mm-hmm.
do that, just like Substack is trying to
Mm-hmm.
algorithmically recommend different newsletters. But by far, the primary mode of curation in podcasting, just like it is in newsletters, is person to person, word of mouth, right? You hear about a podcast, someone tells you about it, you hear the host on another show, you like what you hear, and then you go over and you check that out. So you have these direct trust linkages. This
Mm-hmm.
person who I already know and trust because I've been listening to their show for a long time has on and likes this person who has their own show. Now I'm going to go try that. That is a
Mm-hmm.
very human way of discovering content. It's very different than algorithmic discovery. Email newsletters have a similar fundamental dynamic. How do email newsletters grow? It's not because Substack recommends it on some sort of feed, though they're trying. It's because people forward newsletters they like, they subscribe to, they forward it to a friend. Oh, I was thinking about you. I know this because I have an email newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is like 1% of the time when
Mm-hmm.
people go to forward one of my posts to a friend of theirs, they accidentally press reply. And so I get I get a lot of these accidentally. Oh, you should check this out. We were talking about this. That is an incredibly human way of spreading content, right? It's
Yeah.
humans talking to other humans they trust. I call this a web of trust distributed model. It's slower. It's a
Yeah, it's
slower way
lower.
to grow
Yeah.
an audience. Yeah, podcasts do not grow exponentially for the most part,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it is organic. I think it's incredibly effective. It also is an incredibly good filter of junk, right? I mean, on social media, everybody looks the same, right? A post on Twitter has the exact same font with the exact same background, with the exact same little gravatar, no matter who's posting it. And then you have algorithms help amplifying what you see and what you don't see. So, like, who knows what uh, damaging or weird or conspiratorial or just like downright angry or offensive, like, who knows what you're going to see? But when you're curating content through webs of trust, you don't end up in those circles unless you want to be there. When it's,
Mm-hmm.
I trust this person, they talked about this person, I checked out that show, I like this show, my friend forwarded me this newsletter, I liked what I saw, so now I subscribe to that newsletter. You can get a really diverse set of content that you're consuming here, but you're not going to end up in the weird corners of the internet. You're not going to end up in the dark corners of the internet. When you're using distributed webs of trust to build out your podcast feed, you don't actually end up with a Nazi or flat earth podcast in your feed, right? Webs of trust are really good at curating because we have all of these social cues and trust cues about what we trust and what we don't trust. So I just think it's a far superior way of finding new information, but it still leverages the wonder of the internet, which is everything is accessible, right?
Yeah.
And this is what I argue. The value of the internet is not that it ensures that everyone is heard from everyone else, but it makes it possible for you to hear from anyone else. All podcasts are accessible. All
Mm,
websites you can go to, right? Uh, it's all accessible because we have these universal protocols. Now, how do you figure out which of these things you listen to? That's where I think the wonder of distributed trust comes into. And you can wander these links of trust and end up in corners and interesting places and be exposed to new ideas. But it's just a fantastic way, I think, of navigating this incredibly dense web of all this information. I think it's much better than instead saying, no, 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 everyone plug into the central computer where we have one algorithm that figures out what you should look at. That's
mhm.
not, I don't think that's the right way of taking advantage of the internet.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, I thought that the algorithm was even taking into account individual preferences. So I expect the algorithm to show what I do like. It's not that I'm entering Instagram and I'm bombed with all this content I don't care about at all. So, but I was curious. So I I saw that you do have an Instagram account. Is it correct? Or
It's
it's
not me.
just
There's a
it's
lot,
not
it's not
you?
me. There's a lot of fake Cal Newports out there.
No way, because I'm gonna tell you the story. So I chose the book as for the book club, and I was talking to my community and saying that it would have been like extremely nice to have a one-to-one interview with the author. And then I was talking to I was like searching on Instagram, and I found a Cal Newport account which looked like very official one, and so I wrote to you, like to this account on Instagram,
Oh
and
no.
of course I didn't have any reply. But then what I did, I uh, placed a screenshot on my Telegram group, and I
Yeah.
said, guys, look, I tried my best to contact Carl, but he didn't reply. And I've been so lucky that a girl who was working in the editor that is Roy Edizioni, that is like editing your book in Italian. She saw the screenshot and she said, oh my god, this girl is like really trying her best to get in contact with Cal, and so I'm going to help her out. And so that we got in touch with email. But I was like, oh my god, he does have an Instagram account, but probably like part of his digital minimalism view, he's not using it. But so it's not you.
No, there's a lot of fake Cal Newports. They're on Instagram. Twitter has a bunch that come and goes. I think there's like a Prof Cal Newport account that often gets tagged when people are commenting. There's some TikTok Cal Newports. There's also confusingly a sort of mysterious TikTok character named Prof Cal, who is actually like an ASMR in the ASMR communities. I often get mixed up with that person as well. So those are all fake accounts, and they're hard to take down too, because it turns out if you don't have an account on the service could care less what you worry about, right? So if you're like,
Hmm.
hey, if you have an account, then they have an official policy of, oh, you're emulating another account, you're copying another account. And but if you don't have an account, they're like, what do we care? Right. So
Yeah,
it's pretty
true.
interesting. I will have often on what I call journalistic burner accounts on those platforms, but it's used for research purposes, right? So like if I need to go and watch a lot of Instagram feeds for an article I'm writing, or if I need to like see what's going on Twitter on a particular topic for an article, I have burner accounts I can use so I can log in and actually like see other feeds, but they're not accounts I
Hmm.
actually use. I do have a podcast. We do, and so this is like an interesting debate. It's a very, I guess, a classic example of digital minimalism. We post the video of my podcast on YouTube.
Yeah, I
Right. So there's a
saw.
big debate like, hey, is YouTube social media or not social media? And my argument is like, well, digital minimalism says who cares? What matters is what's important to you? How does technology help it? Use technology very narrowly for those ways. So my podcast is, I think I'm doing important work with it. There is, I think, a whole segment of potential listeners to the podcast who tend to listen to or watch podcasts through the YouTube platform. And so it makes complete sense. I don't touch YouTube. I mean, I have a YouTube guy that takes the video from my producer and posts it. And like that's a great example of digital minimalism, right? It's not
Mm.
clear binary abstention. It's not this is bad, this is good. It's like what is useful to you? How can you then use these tools in a way that has the proper guardrails on it? So like that
Hmm.
that has been my approach.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that so you build your. I think that you also have a huge audience, like on your newsletter, podcast, and YouTube. Uh, but I think you built your audience through your books, right? Like it was your starting point, and then you managed actually to collect like several people who were interested in what you were writing, in your thoughts. Um, and I was also very impressed by the conversation you had with Sam Harris. So Sam
Mhm.
Harris, just for people who are listening to us, is an American, uh, I think, neuroscientist and also philosopher. And I think he, in one of the interactions that he had with you, he told that he shut down his Twitter account, and I believe that he had 1 million followers on Twitter. But this was, and still he also had an app that I use, like I really love, Waking App. But he of course he shut down this platform, so he's not using anymore Twitter. But he did already build a strong presence online, and I feel that nowadays having a strong presence online is extremely powerful and extremely, let's say, useful. It's something that you can build on, so you can actually create something based on us, on
Yeah,
an online audience.
but yeah,
So if you were to start from zero, and if you would like to actually do something like this, so connect with people, inspire people, and so on, where would you start from?
yeah. I mean, my word of warning for people who are interested in having a big audience for useful purposes, which I agree, the internet's fantastic for this. Uh, Social media based audiences, so audiences that originate mainly just in social media and social media posting, are
Mm-hmm.
fragile and relatively on their own, not nearly as useful as
Mm-hmm.
online audiences built other ways, right? So there, if you build, let's say, um, a really big Instagram following and it just exists in Instagram, that is a much weaker audience. If you have an audience that's a fifth of that size, but is on an email newsletter, for example, that email newsletter audience is probably going to be much more powerful. So this is something that's been kind of borne out again and again, is that I call them native social media audiences. So it's an audience that grew just from social media interaction, exists only on social media. Those can look very large, but actually
Mm-hmm.
have a very small footprint when it comes to actually wanting to affect action, like
Mm-hmm.
buying a book or going to do something, right? So for me, I think the right way to build an online audience is to be doing something that is valuable,
Mm-hmm.
doing something that's hard and valuable. Leverage the internet and social media, for example. Like, you should see that as a way that makes it easier for people to discover the really valuable thing you're doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think podcasting can be very valuable. Having a really good podcast is hard, right? Social media, YouTube can help
It's very
sort of
hard.
spread the word about that. But that is itself a thing of real value, because a podcast listener puts it in their ear. They have a parasocial relationship with you. It can really have an impact on their life and their week in a way that, if it's just your Instagram feed, you're one of 1,000 that sort of comes through. Email newsletters are very powerful, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
have a strong, organically grown email newsletter, those people, like, they care about what you have to say and they're more willing to listen to it. Authors know this. Email newsletters convert powerfully into book sales. Instagram, Twitter followers, for example, not at all, right? I mean, it's just kind of random whether they convert to the book sales or not. So, like, my advice for people would be, you need to be doing something that's hard and valuable, and then take advantage
Mm-hmm.
of the internet to help people not only find what you're doing, but then once they find you, have a way of staying in touch with you and being a part of your world.
Yeah.
But don't think that the thing that you're going to build your audience on, don't let that just be, I have an entertaining feed on social media. And in fact, the degree to which you don't have social media be the core site for your audience, the better, because as you probably know from experience, you're ceding a lot of control. Like, Instagram could change completely how they share feeds, like what they promote, what they don't promote, how you can interact with your followers, right? Like, you really are at the mercy of these existing companies. Whereas if you have your own
True.
email list or you have a podcast following, I think that's much more powerful. So, like, I think the way I did it's not a bad model. It was books, and people like my books, and they found me through my books, and because of that, I would be interviewed a lot, and I started being a podcast guest early in the days of podcasts. So starting around 2014, I became a sort of perennial podcast guest, and so I had a big footprint in sort of the internet world, because I wrote these books, and people liked the books, and I was often on air, so to speak, talking about these books, and people could discover me through hearing me on these different podcasts or this or that, and that built up over time my audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
But I see the internet as a way to, yeah, give a home for the people who discover what I'm doing, but not make it be the source of the thing I'm doing.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's very interesting. And Cal, have you ever thought about quitting your job as a professor and focusing only on your books and podcast career?
Well, I like being a professor, but also what I do now as a professor is pretty closely related. So, I'm a
Mm-hmm.
computer scientist, but increasingly within the broad field of computer science in the past few years, I've been focusing more and more on what's called digital ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a founding member of my university's Center for Digital Ethics. I'm directing a academic program called
Okay.
Computer Science Ethics in Society. So actually, like more to more, what I'm doing as an academic now is writing about technology, how we grapple with technology, how it impacts us, what we should do about it. So, you know, my writing is not unrelated to my professorship anymore. Those worlds are coming together. And so it doesn't feel as if the
So,
academic life is an obstacle to this other thing I want to do. I've been trying to merge these two things together. Though I will say, if I have a particularly hard run of faculty meetings, it
mhm.
is a nice daydream. I do make significantly more money as a writer and podcaster than I do as a professor. So it really is the academic attraction that I have to the academy keeping me there right now.
Yeah. And do you think that it's also beneficial for your creativity? So the fact that you have like a different kind of job as well that you have on the side. So you don't need to constantly focus on being creative, on coming up with the next book and so ever. Do you think this
Yeah.
is helping out?
Oh, I think it really has. Yeah, yeah. I mean, also there's just a lot of smart people in
Mm-hmm.
the academic world, especially thinking about these issues of digital ethics and technology's impact. It's just a different way of thinking than I think the more entirely online crowd, which
Mm-hmm.
there's these just much more rigorous academic theory going on, much more challenges happening, and so yeah, it can be pretty exhilarating to be
Mm-hmm.
around some of these really big minds that are also grappling with the same. So I learn from them, and then they're always trying to learn from me about like, well, how do I start a podcast? And so we have this really nice sort
Love
of
it.
back and forth.
Love it. And talking about technology, I read that your really peculiar view on digital detox. So I used to do a lot of digital detox, but not in a, let's say, mindful way, in a way that I'm like separating what is at the end of the digital detox, saying, okay, this is superficial and this is the track that I will keep like following for the next days. I was just, okay, from one day to the other, I will just remove completely my technology, my media, and whatever, and will just isolate. And then when I opened up my phone again, I was like fed with all these notifications and so on. So, what is the approach that you suggest to digital detox? And are you like, how are you managing your distancing from technology in your daily life? Do you do,
Yeah,
for instance, periods in which you're just like removing everything uh, and
yeah.
focusing on the real world?
Well, I think people who use the phrase digital detox are using the term detox wrong.
Mm,
In a way that to me is pretty obvious, right? I mean, detox, they're referencing the use of that term in substance abuse recovery, drug recovery, drug addiction recovery, and alcohol addiction recovery, right? Where like you go through a detox phase as part of
mm-hmm,
recovery. But you don't, let's say you're in alcohol recovery. Clearly, what you don't do
mm-hmm,
is say, here's what I'm going to take a break from alcohol for a month
mm-hmm,
and then just go back to drinking all out after the month is over. Like, what would the
mm-hmm,
point of that be? That no, detox in the alcohol community is this is the phase in which I'm diminishing that like very strong chemical urge to drink as step one of many steps of having an alcohol free life. So
mm-hmm.
this use of detox, when people really mean take a break, has been a bit of an issue for me because I think taking a break is not necessarily that interesting of a strategy. Right.
Mhm,
I don't
mhm,
know any other, again, sort of substance or behavioral abuses where the strategies are built around occasionally take a break from the thing that's causing harm in your life. Like the goal should be completely reforming permanently your relationship with this thing so it's no longer a source of harm in your life. Right. So I
mhm,
don't like the way digital detox is used. Uh, I use the term digital declutter to try to separate from that. And my use of this term is much more like you would see in the substance abuse community, where you do take this really hard break from most of these optional technologies. And then when
mhm,
you're done, you completely reform your relationship. Which
mhm,
of these tools, if any, are going to come back into my life? And if they do, they're going to come back with very specific controls. I think
mhm,
that's the right way to do it. most people who follow this sort of minimalist philosophy will resample it or return to it about once a year. In
Okay.
terms of my own technology uses, this of course is how I manage my uses. It's the you have to earn your way into my life mindset.
Mm.
What thing is this technology going to help, and what guardrails am I going to put around it? And because
Mm-hmm.
of that, I have a very slowly evolving portfolio of technological use, because most things don't pass that barrier. So like the
Yeah,
last
for
major
instance.
change would have been probably putting my podcast on YouTube. Like that was probably like the last major change to my technology portfolio.
Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, could you describe your, I don't know, a day in your life in terms of you wake up, what's the first thing you do? When do you interact with technology? I was really interested in the way you replied to messages. So, um, I believe that you use time boxing, right? So you divide your like day into boxes, and you have like specific activities into that are falling into specific times. Is this also related to, I don't know, replying to messages, replying to emails? So how is the interaction with technology structured in your daily life?
Well, it depends on the time of year. So I'm
Mm,
very seasonal in my work, which makes sense as a professor, right? So like
mm,
right now it's in summertime.
mm-hmm,
In summertime, I have a very specific schedule I try to make, which is the first thing I do each work day is deep work, typically writing, right? So that's the first thing I do. I'm not looking at email. I'm not, looking at other types of technology. It's deep work until about midday, right?
mm,
Um,
okay,
then I typically have 2 days a week where after that, this is my summer schedule, is then I
okay,
have like a half hour to an hour of admin time. This is email, this is tasks. I'm following up on things. If I have to make a quick call, I'm going to make that call. And then another 3 days a week, I'll have a fuller afternoon where I'll do things like what we're doing now. Let me have interviews, let me have meetings. All that's going to happen in the afternoon. So in the summer, I like to have 2 days where it's just deep work, quick admin, checking with technology, and then shut down early, and 3 days where it's deep work, and then a more administrative afternoon, email, interviews, etc., and then a clear shutdown after that. During the semester, when I'm teaching, for example, it's typically all 5 days follow that pattern of first things first is deep work.
mm-hmm,
Then it switches over to time blocked. I call it administrative time, but it's like there's an email block in there. There's going to be meetings in there. There's going to be, I need to work on uh, my syllabus for my course, all of the other stuff that happens, and then a clear shutdown at the end of the day. So
mm-hmm,
I'm pretty rigorous about when certain types of work happens, both within a given day and
mm-hmm,
also, how that pattern changes during different seasons of the year.
mm-hmm. How important is to have a shutdown at the end of the day?
I
Do you
think it's
think?
critical. Yeah,
Mm,
especially if you have a sort of complicated or demanding knowledge work job. If you don't have a clear shutdown, work is going to follow you throughout the evening, right?
mm-hmm,
You're like, oh, what about this? What about that? Maybe I should just check my inbox because I want to see if this person wrote me. Or I think this is just as common. If I see that no one wrote me, I can have some relief. Like, okay, I'm not missing anything. And we sort of drag out work. We also drag out what I call professional rumination. So like a internal dialogue with ourselves about like, am I falling behind on this? Did I forget about this? Oh man, what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to tell my boss?
mm,
A shutdown routine stops all of that, right? And what you
mm-hmm,
do is at the end of your workday, you close all the open loops. All right. Is there anything floating I need to write down and make sure it's stored somewhere? Is there anything urgent I'm missing in my inbox? Great. What's my plan for tomorrow? How does that fit in with my bigger plan for the week? Yes, this all makes sense. I'm on track. I'm safe to shut down. And now I'm going to do some sort of ritual to indicate that I'm shutting down the day, which could be saying a particular phrase. Or, like my planner I sell has a box you check, like a very specific box you check that says shutdown complete. And then what happens is later in the evening, when your
mm-hmm,
brain is like, what about this? What about that? Do we really have a plan? Let's go back over things again. Instead of actually engaging in the details of your professional situation, you said, I said the phrase or I checked the checkbox. I would not have done that if I wasn't satisfied that I've gotten done what I need to get done and I have a good plan for the week ahead. So, hey brain, we can get back into this tomorrow, but I know there's nothing really urgent. And
mm-hmm.
it's a
Got it.
fantastic tool because after a couple weeks of doing this, your brain stops being so urgent about it and it learns to just relax. Hey, work is
Yeah.
done. Let's focus on something else until the next day.
Yeah, I love it. I read it in deep work, and really it has been life changing for me as well. Yeah. I had a question on slow productivity. I really loved the book, and I noticed that you, of course, mentioned how this culture and this way of living based embracing slow productivity has helped many authors, but also musicians to deliver great pieces of work. And I was impressed by the fact that several of your samples, if I'm not wrong, are mentioning artists. Do you think that this culture of slow productivity is also compatible with, for instance, someone who is trying to build a company? So, someone who is, for instance, working in a startup environment. So, let's suppose that I want to build my own startup, which is by almost default based on velocity and of like being able to deliver and to adapt very fast. So the slow concept and doing less is not totally applicable. Do you think that the two concepts are still compatible? So working in this dynamic environments and embracing slow productivity?
I mean, in some sense, that's the whole point of the book, is that we can take these ideas that artists and writers and scientists have figured out over the last 500 years, and we can adapt them like modern fast-paced digital knowledge work jobs, being in a startup, being in an office job. So like the whole book is, how do we identify what these other people figured out who had all sorts of like autonomy and flexibility to experiment and figure out what works and what doesn't. If you want to try to create valuable things with your brain, we can adapt that then to office work. In fact, it's a very Italian idea, because the whole notion of a slow movement, right, goes back to
Yeah.
Carlos Petrini and slow food, where his whole notion was, if we want to figure out how to eat in the modern world, let's draw from some more older wisdom where people thought a lot about this. Well, I'm saying the same thing about work. Let's look at how the original knowledge workers, who were
Hmm.
scientists and artists and poets, etc. How did they figure out over hundreds of years, like, what's the best way to create really valuable stuff? Now let's adapt that to this modern world, right? So then if you look into the principles of slow productivity, all of them apply to the modern digital workplace. Like, think about principle one, do fewer things, right? What that really means is do fewer things at the same time. Why do you want to do fewer things at the same time? Well, if you're working on too many things concurrently, what happens is that each of these things that you're working on brings with it its own collection of administrative overhead, right? I've committed to doing this thing, this project, this contract, this new feature I'm trying to add to my website. There's emails I have to send, there's meetings I have to have. If you're doing
Hmm.
too many things at the same time, all of this administrative overhead begins to pile up into your schedule until you eventually cross a point where most startup entrepreneurs find themselves, where the vast majority of your day is servicing the administrative overhead of all these things you've agreed to do, leaving very little time to actually do the fundamental tasks. So then when you zoom out, the pace at which you're actually completing things drastically slows down.
Hmm.
So now suddenly the entrepreneur who's saying, no, I'm going to do two things at a time, finish this, then take in something new. Finish this, I'll
Hmm.
bring in something new. They actually start finishing things at a much faster rate than the entrepreneur who is working on more things at the same time, right? So actually doing fewer things, it's a slower notion of productivity because it feels less frantic, but the pace of completion can actually be faster. Same thing, principle three of slow productivity, obsess over
Quality.
quality. This is so critical for startup entrepreneurs, right? It's a
Hmm.
competitive marketplace out there. No one directly values your ability to answer emails very quickly. That's not valuable in itself. No one values your capability of I'm responding to lots of like social media posts, or I'm doing like the right things to format. Like, that's mildly useful, but anyone can do that. What matters is, what do you do that's rare and valuable that only you can do, or you do at a very high level? Ultimately, that is going to be the main source of like all of your success. So obsessing over quality, doing the thing you do best better, is going to
Hmm.
be well more fruitful in the long term than like obsessing over the little details, the things that anyone can do, but they feel more satisfyingly complete. Like, I can watch some tutorials about the right way to schedule my post on Instagram with the right fonts. Like, that's fine. But like, what really matters is the thing you're posting about gets better. That's really where the energy should go. So I think these slow productivity ideas, I mean, the whole notion is what we would have seen, Jane Austen doing in the 18th century. There's a kernel of truth in there can apply to someone who has a Slack account and an
Hmm.
internet-based business.
Hmm. And what's your completely different topic? What's your take on AI? Do you think that AI will change the logic of digital minimalism and productivity?
It might have an impact on productivity, not in its current form. So its current form, at least the AI we think about today, is mainly these large language model based tools like Claude, like ChatGPT. These are text generation tools. I think the impact of that on productivity is going to be relatively limited. I mean, a lot of what
Mm,
that's doing is what I call fast productivity. They're promising to take things you already do and to speed that up. So we
mm,
can help you write emails faster, so language model can jump in there. We can help you like more easily take notes on your meetings because the language model can jump in there. So it's like stuff you're doing, help that go faster. Historically, when we use technology just to speed up things we already do, we just add more things to the day. We just do more of it. It doesn't make the day feel substantively better. The real thing to look out for is actually AI that also has some sort of goal-based control logic, right?
mm.
So right now
What
I
do you
can use
mean?
a tool. So like I can use a tool like ChatGPT right now to help me write an email. Like, okay,
Hmm.
can you help me write an email that says this and it can produce some text? What you really should be looking for is a tool that can actually answer emails on your behalf. Now,
Mm,
that
yeah.
requires more than the ability to just generate or summarize text. It requires, for example, and I wrote an article last spring about this in the New Yorker if you want to find out more, but it requires an ability to simulate the minds of other people and simulate the future. Like, what is going on here? What's the objective that's being discussed here? Oh, the objective is we need to set up some way, we have to discuss this initiative. Okay. What are the different possibilities for trying to reach this objective? Well, if we set up a meeting, we could figure out this, and then what would come next? Okay, that's not good enough. But if we got this information, then set up a meeting, then we could get to this objective. So you're figuring out a plan of action that makes sense, right? This is all not a language model, but just other types of AI tools. Then you can look to a language model and say, great, write an email for me that is going to propose this particular plan of action that we just figured out. That's what you need if you want, for example, AI to answer emails for you. This is when we
Hmm.
would see a major substantive change to our day to day, when we're not just speeding up our own interaction with administrative overhead, but we're actually able to completely outsource that. And that requires fundamentally new technologies in addition to just what we're seeing with language models. So don't be caught in the trap of thinking as we make these language models bigger, as we take
Mm,
that digit at the end of ChatGPT and increase it, that we are going
hmm.
to continue to grow the breadth of activities that this AI can interact with. Actually, language models by themselves have a relatively limited end game. It's going to have to
Mm,
be language models plus other tools. That's what to look for when it comes to productivity hits. It's going to be language
mm.
models plus and then other things.
Yeah, that's really interesting because one like traditional thought is that we will be able to free up more time so that AI is going to replace some repetitive tasks. But actually, this is not happening right now. I mean, like you still have to control what the I don't know optimized email looks like. You need still to try the prompt until it looks like satisfactory. So it's actually true that for the moment is just probably we're just in the beginning of this phase. Maybe we're getting there, as you said, and maybe once we're getting there, we'll have to deal with expanded time. So we'll have actually more leisure time to invest. We'll probably getting bored more. So what's your take on that? So what do you think?
Yeah.
What will the future of leisure look like, and the future of work as well?
Well, look, we'll see, right? Because there's a couple warnings here. Like one is this warning of just speeding up stuff doesn't necessarily slow down our day, and I think
Mhm.
a great case study here is email, right? So
Mhm.
this is a book I wrote called A World Without Email, where I tell this story, but it came from IBM in the late 80s, where they developed. I mean, this is early in the days of corporate email. They wrote their own email software. They said we're going to deploy this, and they did all of these tests internally at the IBM headquarters of they measured all of the communication that people were doing. And back then it was voicemails, memos, and leaving notes. There's like a big culture of like you would walk over to someone's desk, and if they weren't there, you would leave a note, and then they would see the note later, and then they'd come back to your desk. They measured all this, and they were like, "This is great. Email can do all of these things, but it's much faster, right? Because I can just email you instead of having to put a note down. Um, you don't have to dial into your voicemail. You'll just see the messages right there. And so they're like, clearly, this is going to free up a lot of time
Mm-hmm.
because all of this communication we do is all going to become like 2 or 3 times faster. They deploy this email within like a few days. The server they provision melted down, overload, right? And like, what's going on here? It increased the amount of communication. The presence of email just increased the amount of communication by a factor of 5. So people didn't just say, great, I'm going to do exactly what I was doing before, but it's going to take less time, and now I have more time to do other things. They just started communicating more, right? So that's always a threat when you just try to speed things up. That's why, yeah, I think the more substantive shift would be if AI could take over actual administrative overhead, not like help you do the thing you're doing faster, but prevent you from having to do it. The best case scenario there, I think, would be days that had many fewer context shifting and much more what I would call deep work sessions, right? So if you had essentially an AI chief of staff, like a president might have, that just comes to you and says, here's what we're working on next, and here's what you need, and read this and make a decision, and then I'll take that away from you. Now work on this next. In theory, that would be a way more productive use of human brains, and it would be more enjoyable for people because you're not frantically switching back and forth and distracted. You're like, I'm just going to do this until it's done. Whether we get there or not will be interesting. I mean, my other point of caution is because I've been covering, this technology for the New Yorker since ChatGPT came out. I mean, the original predictions was we're 6 months away from work as we know it being fundamentally rewired. We're now a couple years out. We still haven't really seen broad, substantial changes. So this technology in its current form factor, like you talk into a chat interface to a chatbot, in its current form factor, does not seem to be delivering the fundamental transformations that were feared and promised. So at the very least, we're going to have to see an evolution of this form factor away from us just typing into a chat window. Because again, most of the examples we have of this causing disruption are pretty narrow. It's like this company built a tool that replaced these jobs, but it's like this one company did it, right? We're not yet seeing, major sectors drastically changing yet. So the current form factor plus the current technology is not by itself the game changer. We've had enough time for that to happen. So it's going to be a question of what comes next.
And in terms of skills, like which skills would you suggest to focus on nowadays to maybe prepare for the future, or to master, for instance, this needs that are coming up in the future?
Yeah, I wouldn't worry right now about trying to master existing AI tools, unless you're a company that builds these tools for other companies, because there's a good marketplace for that right now. Because again, I think the form factor in which this AI, if it's going to have a substantial disruptive impact, we're not there yet, right? So to spend a lot of time right now learning how to write prompts for ChatGPT, I think is a waste. Because I think probably the way large language models are going to be much more substantially integrated into work is not going to be us typing prompts into a chat window. It's not going to be the way we interface with it. It's going to be more prompt injection. It's going to be more natural language. It's going to be more closely integrated with tools. So it's too early now. It's too early now to say there's a skill here you need to pick up. The other thing we know is these are consumer-facing productivity technologies. With like these consumer-facing productivity technologies, they are typically, if they're going to have a big impact, are not at all hard to learn, right? Like email, because again, this is something I've done a lot of history writing on, is like the history of email. This had a drastic impact very quickly on the world of office work. It required no special training to learn. Like when email hit its final form that allowed it to sort of spread everywhere in the late 90s, early 2000s, it took like 17 seconds to learn. Yeah. Oh, I put your name here and I write here and I press send. Google was the same way. Incredibly disruptive to the information landscape, being able to get basically any information off the public web in front of you that solved this huge problem. It took 4 seconds to learn. The whole point about Google was you just sort of type what you're looking for, however you want to type it, and it will find it for you. So if AI is going to have a huge, like a broad impact across like office work in general, it's not going to be hard to learn when it gets into its final form factor. That kind of comes part and parcel. Personal computers that was a little harder for people to learn, like how does the point and click interface work? But again, it wasn't that hard, especially for young people. In the early 90s, when that took over the front office, people picked up pretty quickly, oh, here is how I move around a computer screen. So anyways, I think right now it's like where we were in like the early days of personal computers, where if you're spending a lot of time learning like the DOS prompt and how to program in BASIC on a 1986 Apple II or whatever, um, that wasn't that useful. By
Mm.
1992, everyone was using Windows, and there was no DOS prompts, and you didn't have to program your own things. So I think it's a
Mm-hmm.
watch and wait right now.
Watch and wait. Okay, like it. Um, Final question. I can see that we're almost out of time. Really, like time flies when talking to you. It's like very interesting. Um, Cal, what's your measure of success in life?
Well, professionally, I care about impact, right? I also care a lot about figure out what it is you think you can do well, and then trying to do that thing really well, right? Like, so the whatever thing you think you have, like this is something
Mm-hmm.
I could make an impact on, and it could be leadership. It could be like people around me, being like a leader for people around me. It could be a particular like artistic skill. It could be a technical skill. It could be like an entrepreneurial zeal, like taking the thing that for whatever mixtures of context and circumstance you can do well. It's like, okay, let me focus on that and push that. Let me not dilute my energy doing 7 other things at the same time. I don't want to wander through life. I'm much more interested in what, on the podcast we call the deep life, which is a life lived intentionally.
Mm.
I'm doing this on purpose because this matters to me, and I'm trying to minimize other stuff that gets in the way or doesn't matter to me. I want my life to be very intentionally crafted, not haphazard. I want to be a life I'm pretty proud of. Like, yeah, look, this is kind of cool what I'm doing here. I like what I'm doing on the day to day. So for me, that's going to be success, is crafting a deep life, and professionally, like really having an impact by pushing on the things that you do well, and try not to dilute your attention and energy too much on the things that you don't.
Mm. Going back, just like really last question. Going back in your late 20s, early 30s, would there something differently that you would do from what you actually did?
I mean, typically, I have a vision based on the decade, right? So, like in my
Mm.
20s, uh, I was trying to establish myself professionally as what I wanted to be as a professor and a writer. Right. So I
Mm-hmm.
came into my 20s knowing like that's what I want to do. I want to be a professor and a writer. And my 20s were all like super myopically focused, professionally speaking, on learning how to being a successful, like how do I become a professor, right? Training to become a professor. I was at MIT, like really hardcore training to become a professor. And how do I become like a really known writer? And so I started writing books early. I sold my first book like right after my 21st birthday. Throughout my 20s, I was writing my initial books, which were like advice guides. They're aimed more at students, but I was learning the craft, right? So that's what my 20s were about, is uh, build up these valuable professional skills, right? So by
Mm-hmm.
the end of my 20s, I succeeded in that, right? So I became a professor at whatever it was, 29 or 30. My fourth book, which was like my first major, like general audience hardcover idea book, that came out on my 30th birthday as well, right? So I was like, okay, I get to my 30s.
Which was the book?
It was called So Good They Can't Ignore You,
Ah, okay, yeah,
which
yeah,
I think
okay.
there's an Italian version of. I think so. Um,
Mm-hmm. I think as
so
well.
that so then I was like, okay, I've now established myself. I can write sort of substantial books, and I got hired as a professor, right? So then my 30s, okay, when I was in my 30s, I was trying to. The whole goal for that was like, okay, now I want to like craft a life, not just a professional life, but a life in general, that it's like to my specific. Like I want to craft a good life, like where I live, starting a family, where I live with my family, like what we're involved with, what I'm doing with my work, the type of things I'm working on. This was all about like I want to craft like a successful life. I want to be able to I want to be able to provide for my family, not just financially, but like be in a good place. And then like that's what my 30s were about. And so in my
Mm-hmm.
30s, I moved up through all the ranks of being a professor, right? I got tenure and then got promoted to full professor. I'm like out of places to go as a professor. In my 30s is where my writing career took off. And that's where I wrote Deep Work, and that was my first sort of like major bestseller. And my books after that. Suddenly, all my books are now New York Times bestsellers, and those things are doing real. So that's like where I was, okay, I want to take these skills I built in my 20 and build a really intentional, successful life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now in my 40s, it's like a completely different role. Now I worry more about um, legacy and impact. And now I've done that. Now, how do I like engineer much more like remarkability into my life? How do I take this success out for a spin to create like the most interesting, high impact decade possible for me and my family? So I see each decade separately.
Mm-hmm.
Here is the challenge of this decade. And that's been useful to me. right? Because you can get paralyzed thinking about where you want to be when you're 50, when you're 23, right?
Yeah.
But in my 20s, I was like, I know where I want to be. Is like I got to find a way to be a more successful writer than I am. I got to find a way to be like succeed in academia, like everything. I didn't do any social media. I wasn't doing anything, right? I was just writing and doing academic work. Like my whole life was like dedicated to that, so like each decade has a different feel for it.
Yeah, you had a strong determination. I feel that you always had a strong determination. You really had a clear vision of where you wanted to land to, and actually, you managed to arrive there.
I mean, everything takes 10 years. That's the reality. Like anything that's like interesting and is going to return interesting yields takes about 10 years. So, I was really influenced by a Steve Martin, the comedian, and he wrote this professional biography in 2006 called Born Standing Up. And I read that. I was in second year grad student. And it was really influential because in it, like one of his big messages is if you want to like be very successful at something, you have to be diligent in pursuing that thing. And he said diligence is not just about returning to the same thing again and again. It's also continually saying no to the other things, right? Like it took him about a decade to break out as a comedian. He's like, you have to be willing to just keep doing the thing and not doing other things. And it takes a long time, but that was really influential to me. Like, I can do that. Great. I'm just going to focus like a laser on computer science research and writing. I'll do this for a decade and really not do anything else. And you know what? Like a decade later, I'm in an interesting place. Like, oh, I got hired as a professor. These are hard positions they got. Like, this is my first like really big book deal, so it was interesting, but I think everything worthwhile takes 10 years. Like my podcast is 4 years old. I
Okay.
think,
Okay. So
you know,
let's see in 6 years where it
it's,
lends
it's
to.
exactly like, I think it's slow. You know how podcasts are. It's
Yeah.
slow
Yeah. Yeah. I
growing. I'm
do.
happy where it is now. It's a successful podcast. It's maybe, 50,000 download an episode podcast. I think give it 3 more years. If I really keep focused on it relentlessly, I like this could be something that like later in my 40s is like a major thing that I'm working on and a major part of my like reaching out in the world. But I'm seeing in that time frame, right? Because if I
Mm-hmm,
was seeing it
mm-hmm.
like I want this thing to be successful, I would have given up after the first year because like this is
Yeah.
fine. It's growing, but it's not huge. So why am I wasting my time? But with the long term, I'm like, as long as it keeps growing, as long as I still see the potential, be willing to go 6, 7, 8 years to really reap the benefits.
Cal, thank you so much for this conversation. Like, literally, I have the feeling that we covered so many topics and it was extremely insightful. I can't wait to host you again in Italy, maybe actually, with the next time in person. And yeah, that's it. Thank you again. It was really a pleasure for me.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, I enjoyed it. And I do think a lot of the books we talked about, I think, are in Italian.
Yeah.
I think Slow Productivity, because I did some interviews for some Italian newspapers. So I think that book is out in Italian. Deep Work is certainly out in
Slow
Italian.
productivity is in Italian. I can
Yeah,
confirm.
there
I
it is
have it
right there.
here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I love that market. I love the country. So I'm happy to be able to talk to your audience. And I think you can find hopefully a lot of what we're talking about you can find in your native language.
Yeah, sure. Thank you again, Cal.
All right. Thank you. I enjoyed it.